that free markets will not only maximize growth, but also create inclusive economic systems that are stable in the long term. In other words, they will maximize growth, equity, and economic stability. And I think we can use three sort of theoretical propositions to demonstrate that account. First of all, somebody told me, the 18th century, David Hume produced a fundamental critique of mercantilist trade theory that asserted that governments and states and countries would optimize their welfare if they continuously maximized export surpluses and minimized imports, and therefore continuously accumulated gold and other products from abroad. And what he showed was that a country that remains in continuous balance of surplus will perhaps, on that basis, create full employment. Once it creates full employment, continuous import of surpluses will actually generate additional demand, additional costs locally. That will, in the absence of imports, increase costs and prices and produce inflation rather than growth and welfare. In other words, a continuous balance of payment surplus is not only going to be problematic at the systemic level, as I'll show in a while, but also is counterproductive because at the end of the day, people cannot benefit by consuming these surpluses. The Chinese at the moment have $1 trillion worth of surpluses that they are foolish enough to be lending to the United States in order to increase demand and consumption in the US rather than for poor people in China. That gives you a sense of how irrational that process can be. Secondly, of course, we have Ricardo's classic model of the benefits of comparative advantage. I assume that most of you here are probably fully aware of this model. Let me just very briefly just take you through it. In two countries in which one country is less efficient and cost competitive in both industries, in all its industries, than another higher cost country, trade will nevertheless benefit the poor country as well as the rich country if they open their borders. That appears counterintuitive, and that's why mercantilism was as strong as it was, because the assumption is that the high-cost country will be penetrated by the by imports from the low-cost country in all of its sectors. But what Ricardo demonstrated was, with this classic model, that if England, for example, produces cloth and wine, its cloth costs 100 whatever per unit and wine 110, whereas in Portugal, cloth costs 90 and wine costs 80. England still benefits by having free trade with Portugal because, of course, Portugal will then expand its output of wine to Britain, so we'll be able to buy cheap wine, much cheaper wine than we can produce locally. The effect of that will be to increase the demand for labor in the wine industry, and Portugal will simultaneously reduce its output of cloth because it will import cloth from England and will absorb that cloth, that labor into the wine industry. England, on the other hand, because it is able to get cheaper wine, will be able to export its more cloth to Portugal because Portugal now is under too much pressure because labor has shifted from the Portuguese cloth sector to the Portuguese wine sector. The effect of this is what economists call Pareto optimal. Everybody gains, nobody loses until after the costs of restructuring have been absorbed. There are clearly going to be problems when we move people from one sector to another. But we can see that in the long run, comparative advantage means that everybody gains. And finally, we can see how these two basic assumptions explain the Lewis model, which is his notion of a world in which we have high levels of underemployment and low wages in one part of the world. When he wrote this model, he'd just been working in Ghana, and full employment and high wages and high technology in another. In a world like that, with free trade, free movement of capital, free movement of commodities, it makes sense. Indeed, it does more than make sense. Capitalists in the high-wage economy that is under pressure from full employment will be forced to transfer their surplus capital into low-wage areas, because that will make them more competitive and enable them to keep their businesses going in those areas. So there will be a natural tendency, driven by market forces, that will move capital out of areas where it is fully employed and where the costs of labor and other inputs are high, and send it to areas that where there is underemployment and much lower levels of productivity. And of course, the effect of this will be to increase profits in the companies that send their surpluses abroad. It will increase productivity and output because it will draw workers out of underemployed industries in the backwoods of Ghana into high technology industries and produce dramatic growth. And of course, you can indeed only explain the ability of China, South Korea, Taiwan, and so on to grow at 7 or 8 or 10% a year by recognizing that this is the way in which this process has actually been happening. So, these, I think, are the sort of fundamental central rocks on which a neoliberal theory of even development actually depends. It explains why we have seen these massive transfers of new technology from rich to poor areas. It explains the huge and dramatically increased growth in industry and services in poor areas. And it also tells us why so many of the attempts at structuralist centralized control, like command economies in the Soviet Union, and indeed in ISI programs in many parts of the Third World, were so counterproductive. It also tells us why a lot of problems are going on today. For example, we can explain many of the inequalities and weaknesses in a lot of particularly agricultural third world countries, not by the problems, the infant industry problems I'm going to talk about, but because of agricultural protectionism in first world countries that are actually blocking third world access to first world markets. It also, I think, tells us why over and undervalued exchange rates in China and the Eurozone have a great deal to do with the current crisis. And just as a final point, accepting those arguments does not mean that that liberals do not believe in the necessity for a strong state. The critical position that liberals take is that we need strong states to supplement the role of capitalist markets, but the critical principle that should govern the role of that state is that its primary objective should not be to restructure the way market relationships operate, but to regulate and strengthen. And therefore, the assumption is that our starting point is that free markets will maximize both development and even growth and inclusive growth, provided that the state regulates but does not restructure and interfere with those free market processes that I've talked about already. Okay, and I think one can accept the power of that argument But I think we also have to raise some serious questions about what happens when free trade leads to labor-saving technological change and other economies of aggregation that generate increasing return. I will argue now that this will block the equilibrating processes outlined above. And let's start by introducing labor-saving technological change into the Ricardian equation. When we do that, what happens? Portugal discovers that it can make an extra 20–30% profit by exporting wine to England, because the prices of wine in England are so much lower than in Portugal. At the same time, it discovers that it can change the way it lays out its vines. It can introduce tractors and other technology into it. It can use herbicides and pesticides to control weeds. And it can expand output by 30% while reducing labor by 30% as a result of introducing labor-saving technological change. The costs of doing this are very high, and the technological requirement is an expansion in the unit of output in order to pay for the costs of tractors and all these other kinds of products. The effect of that is that when Portugal expands its output and expands its exports to England, it doesn't actually need more labor, instead of which it actually fires labor. And of course, the labor can only go to the cloth sector. The cloth sector, meanwhile, is in a position now to export more products to Portuguese wine producers because their incomes have gone up. So it may well also increase its output.